Cool. So thank you for coming, everyone. This is It Belongs in a Museum. I'm going to talk about video game preservation and what that even means to preserve a video game. My name is Andrew Borman, but we'll jump into kind of what the key questions are for today. One is, who am I? Two, how does a museum actually preserve the history of video games? Three, how can you help preserve the history of video games? But I'll ask you to hold any questions until the end. This is normally like an hour-long talk that I've shortened down as quickly and the best that I possibly can. But I'm going to stick around if you have questions at the end, should I run out of time. So who am I? I'm the digital games curator at the Strong, and I've been there about 6 years. So in addition to working on all sorts of fun exhibits, I actually help preserve the history of video games really in two ways. One is I'm looking at the games that are being created today, the digital things that have been, for the past 15 years on cell phones, digital games on Steam, all of those, but also helping to preserve our physical collection of games, which we'll talk about just how many we have in just a few seconds. And I've been doing that for 6 years at the museum. I've got my undergraduate and master's degree in information science from UAlbany. So it's nice to be back and talking about video games. Hopefully none of you were in my classes because I also talked about video games back then. I was also a school librarian in Schenectady, so I don't recognize anybody, so hopefully none of my students are here. But I've been preserving video game history since 2004. And that was really right before YouTube was a thing. So I started as a blog, then migrated to YouTube. I found games like Star Wars Battlefront 3 from Free Radical Design, the Mega Bloks Halo game. And you can see there was the local paper, the Alt, which I think has unfortunately stopped publishing. I was on the front cover shortly before I took this job. So it's a really fun thing that I've been doing for a long time. There's just not a lot of people who have been in it for a long time. So what is the Strong Museum? The Strong Museum is located in Rochester, New York, so we're a few hours away. You can get there by train, you can get there by car. But our mission is to explore the ways in which play encourages learning, creativity, and discovery, and really how it illuminates cultural history. It is a part of culture, all these things at play. So we're not a video game museum in the traditional sense. Instead, it's really the one-stop shop of, like, you want to look at sports. You want to see, for instance, how tennis came to be. You can look at the history of tennis. You can see the history of board games in tennis. Then you can go and look at games like Pong, all the clones, up to the virtua tennises of today, and really get all of that in one, because really until recent history, video game history drew from these previous forms of history. So that's really one of the things that makes us unique. We're over 380,000 square feet. So I know we're a couple hours away. You may not even know about us, but we're not talking about a small museum. We're talking about something that's really, really large. We're home to the Toy Halls of Fame, so you'll see us in the news announcing new toys in the Hall of Fame very, very soon. We're home to the World Video Game Hall of Fame, the American Journal of Play, an academic journal that scholars, even some from Albany, have contributed to. We have Woodbury School, which is a preschool where my daughter actually goes, so that's fun. And we just started a few years ago the National Archives of Game Show History, so think games Price is Right, Wheel of Fortune, Family Feud. All those things are going to be represented in the museum. And we just opened a 90,000 square foot expansion, largely dedicated to video games, but I'll talk about that in a second. We are a collections-based museum, which means we're really about collecting things, and we do that really, really well. We have over 550,000 objects. I was just talking to the University at Albany's, one of their curators. They have about 3,000 objects, which is very similar to a lot of other places. They normally don't have this many objects, but we have 550,000. And that's everything from the tiniest of doll shoes to action figures, dolls themselves, doll houses. We have an incredible collection, but also board games, role-playing games, thousands of them, and of course, video games. So there's about 65,000 objects related to video games, and that is the games themselves, that is the hardware, that are the action figures related to video games in some way, pins, all sorts of really cool stuff, and some really weird stuff too. But we also are home to the Brian Sutton Smith Library and Archives. So the library has over 225,000 volumes. That's books, magazines, trade catalogs, things that are published that oftentimes you could go out and buy. But also countless linear feet of archival material. So for video games, that's prototype builds, design documents, source code from really, really big companies, but you'll see that in a second. So that's a picture of the libraries on the left. and some of the archives on the right. The archives aren't much to look at until you get into those boxes. So to talk about a few of the non-video game exhibits real quick, we have a mini Wegmans, the best grocery store in the country, according to some. So you can go in there and shop. For those that, participate in an adult drink every once in a while, we do a happiest hour. The computers are actually linked to the real Wegmans computer, so you can go through and scan your beverage. Up in the right is one for the younger kids reading Adventureland. Tons of genres of stories, along with artifacts and really fun ways of interacting with them. Sesame Street there in the middle on the right. You can visit a real-life Sesame Street and see some actual props and characters from the show that are all licensed through the Sesame Company. Down in the right is part of our expansion. That's the Hasbro Game Park, and that is inspired by Hasbro games. So you can see gigantic size Monopoly pieces, Candyland canes that are taller than I am, and of course a Dungeons and Dragons dragon that can breathe fire if you're able to roll the right number. But let's talk video games. So on the right-hand side, we have E-Game Revolution. That is kind of the first real permanent video game exhibit that we've done. And that's going to start undergoing some changes because we've started to take things for the expansion I talked about earlier. Upper left-hand corner is what we call High Score, and that's one of the new exhibit spaces. It's about 15,000 square feet, and that is the home of our World Video Game Hall of Fame. There's a section where you can follow our Women in Games exhibit, and that's both a starting point for that, but also woven throughout all of those stories. There's a giant, almost 90-foot long timeline with objects, the physical timeline, and then 7 projector screens across of digital content that supplement all that. There's cases talking about society, business, art, the player. There's a lot there, and that's just one exhibit. We have a pinball exhibit where you can play many of our pinball games. We have an Age of Empires exhibit right now that was sponsored by Suzanne and Tony Goodman. Tony Goodman founded Ensemble Studios, who made Age of Empires. So you can see the earliest build of that that's known to exist. The original design drawings for some of these things, other artifacts from the Age of Empires series. And then on the bottom, not only do we have the world's largest Donkey Kong machine, which Nintendo helped us with, which was a really cool experience, over 20 feet tall. Coolest thing, it actually hangs from our second floor. We also have an exhibit that we call Level Up. And that one's aimed kind of more 10 years old and up, while High Score is a little bit older. And that's one where you can go, you get your own wristband. And it tracks your progress as you earn achievements along our periodic table of video game verbs. So everything is inspired by that. That's patent pending, by the way. So you're able to earn over 100 achievements throughout that space, all linked back to the history of video games, done in a way that I don't think any other museum has done. So I think it's a really cool place. Then there's all the other stuff that I didn't talk about. So there are a lot of exhibits. There's a lot of fun. If you come, I definitely recommend spend a whole day. Otherwise, we have people who are there even 5 hours who don't get off the first floor. That won't even get you to the video game stuff. So there's a lot to see. So what does it mean to preserve the history of video games? This is very much how we do it. The National Video Game Museum in Texas is going to have a different lens. The Video Game History Foundation is going to have a different lens. I'm friends with all those people. We talk a lot. But this is our lens of how we're preserving the history of video games. So at the center are the games. You can't preserve the history of video games without the games. And I talked about how many thousands of games we have. There's probably about 20 to 30,000 unique video games in the collection alone. Outside of that, we have the producers. We have company material from companies like Atari, Broderbund, who made Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, among many, many other things. Skylanders material from Toys for Bob, where we work for Activision. Key people in there, Carol Shaw, Joyce Weisbecker, Brian Fargo, who worked at Interplay on games like Fallout and Wasteland. So many more where you can actually read the original papers. Outside of that, though, we have the players. The player experience is so important to preserving the history of video games, and it's something that is so easily ignored. Even if I was able to preserve the history of World of Warcraft, we're never going to get the same 20,000 people together to recreate, running through some of those raids. But having a way to preserve that player experience is really key to just knowing how people played games throughout time. On the outside of that, because we're the Museum of Play, we're looking at this through the lens of play. And that's really important too, because like I said, we're not like some of the other institutions. This is how we're looking at things and how it fits into the greater, how video games fit into play in general. So why? Why even preserve the history of video games? The fact is that the video game industry is pretty much the biggest entertainment industry in the world today. People are playing. There are very few people out there that don't play some sort of video game at some point. Whether or not they call themselves a gamer is a different story. I know many people that play many, many hours that wouldn't consider themselves a gamer. But it's also about how we learn. They are our culture. And this work needs to be done now. Unlike other forms of media where you may have a chance to go and recover ancient papyrus from Egypt, that's not going to happen. Floppy disks were really meant to last about 20 to 30 years if they were stored correctly. You start doing the math, the last time a popular game was sold with floppy disks were the 90s, you're over 20 years already. And that's best case scenario. So we've had games where we've opened brand new copies of games from the early 90s and they don't work. They were stored well, they look great, but they don't work. So this work needs to happen now or else we won't have a history to look back on. But luckily, this question is asked less and less as time goes on. I don't have to convince all of you why it's important to preserve the history of video games, I hope. But, that is a question that people still ask. So there are some misconceptions about preservation that I want to talk about. There's this idea that games can be preserved. I've preserved this game, my work is done. That's not how it works. Even once I've migrated a floppy disk to another form of media, now I have to keep that going on and on again. That's something that the movie industry has quickly found out because movies take out such a huge amount of space, let alone all the raw cuts and all that. They've realized, okay, we've moved off of film, we've moved off of digital tape. Now we have to keep doing that every 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. So this is a work that's going to happen not just now, but for the foreseeable future. Old retail games, too, aren't the only things that are at risk. Yes, those floppy disks I talk about, 100% at risk. We need to work on those. Cartridges, they're probably going to be okay so long as they don't have funky batteries that leak. We'll probably be able to go out and find another copy of it. Can you buy a cell phone game on your Verizon Razor phone from 2005? No, you can't do that. And those are things that, when you think about a cell phone, very few people keep their old cell phone. They often trade them in, they give them to somebody else. The first thing you do is you format all the data so nobody steals it. That includes the games that are on there. And without a store to go back to, those games are in high danger of disappearing. And we're seeing that a lot from the Japanese market where they had games that were way better than ours on cell phones way earlier than us. And then they're encrypted, there are all these unique things. It's a really, really hard problem. So it's not just old games. Then you talk about massively multiplayer games. Knockout City was mentioned earlier. That's great because they actually put the server out there for people to play. Most games don't do that. And the other misconception is if it's not on the internet, it's not preserved. People out there on the internet are doing amazing work. I started to do it on YouTube. There's so many people out there doing that. But I use this image of the iceberg to say that only a fraction of video game history is ever going to be online. A larger percentage could then show up in a museum, other educational institutions. But then there's an even bigger part that is only going to exist with developers, and to have developer support is the only way anybody is ever going to access those things again. So the internet is not the only way. It's a great way to do lots of things, sometimes illegally, but it's not the only way to preserve the history of video games. So let's do some collections highlights. I've talked about lots of stuff. This is just a cool shelf with lots of toys on it. But there's something for kids of all ages on the shelves, prototypes of things you like. My dad likes, there's a Davy Crockett gun on there. But Buzz Lightyear, we have prototypes of the Alfie robot. Really cool stuff just on this one row of shelves. We currently have 3 storage spaces for collection storage, not counting the archives and library. So it's a lot of stuff. And also colder storage for paper, but that's another story. But video games. So do we have any programmers out here right now? Yeah, so development tools. These are the tools that were actually used to make video games of the past. The one on the left is really quite rare. It's a 3DO development kit. Early 3D system, never as popular as a PlayStation, Nintendo 64. Very few exist. We're lucky to have one. And the middle is one that's even rarer. Games like NHL 94 were made on this, which is the S-Probe development kit that EA hacked up in a retail Sega Genesis, a Sega Mega Drive, at their offices and made this custom thing. I know of 1 or 2 other ones that exist out of the museum, or outside of the museum. We happen to have 2, which came from a developer on some of those titles I just mentioned. And the Xbox development kit, I have a soft spot for the Xbox. Really cool, because you can have data on the hard drives, but also lots of points of failure. But we're able to show how these games were made. And then you have things like this. Probably none of you have played this system because it never came out. It's the Panasonic M2, so we're going to be putting this one on display very, very soon. It rivaled closer to the Dreamcast, kind of in between the PlayStation and Dreamcast in terms of power. Had some really cool games in development. Was canceled. So very few of these exist outside of a select few collectors and us. This one was luckily on a long-term loan to us with the intent that it will be donated. Let's talk archival material. We have what was left of the Atari coin-op division when they shut down in the early 2000s. So we have things like pictures, Atari offices from the 70s or 80s, seeing people working. Unless you have a time machine, there's no way to see that. And really, so much of this is about the people. We have people working on the manufacturing line. We have design drawings. That's the Street Fighter Deluxe cabinet where you actually hit the buttons, design drawings, mascots. We have source code, cabinet drawings, all sorts of things, and I'm watching my time. How about Mortal Kombat? Some of you have probably seen that. We have the original footage of the actors doing their thing. And this was how the game was made, digitizing real actors. So we have tons of footage like this that exists really only with us. Super Mario Bros. 3, a popular game that sold millions of copies. This one is not one of those ones that sold millions of copies. This was made by a company that was calling themselves at the time Ideas from the Deep. Those first two letters are the key that really show what company made it. Ideas from the Deep would go on to make a game that you may have heard of called Doom. But this was the start of their company. The only place outside of John Romero, one of the developers of Doom and other titles, to have it is us. So you can come and play that game. That was actually for DOS PCs. So they were hoping to be able to do a DOS. There's a great story in the Masters of Doom book if you want to learn more about that. So this is the start of one of the biggest companies in the world for video games. Only way to play it is to come to us. This is a slide that I made actually as I was sitting in the back listening to other talks. Somebody was talking about design Bibles and that sort of thing. We have that sort of thing if you want to look at how certain games were made. In the middle, somebody was saying that they were inspired by Infocom games. Well, we have a collection of Infocom games. We just had a voice actor who was talking about doing voice acting. Who better to learn from than Mark Hamill? Come watch video of him doing acting for Master of Orion, the remake, new version of it sort of thing. We have footage of him going through that process for some of those characters. So many cool things that you can learn as a game developer or a fan or whatever it is. We have that sort of material. Video games. Over 9,000 Japanese video games. We have researchers from Japan come to use our collection. We had a politician from Japan come to look at our collection just over the summer. 9,000 Japanese video games, really amazing collection. So how do you actually access any of this stuff? Like I'm talking about all this, and even with 385,000 square feet, a fraction is going to go out on display at any given time. Well, you can make a research appointment. And what a researcher is, it could be some of you that are working on books, dissertations, all that stuff, but most of you aren't going to do that. It doesn't matter to us. We're really open about having researchers. If you're working on a game, that's great. If you're a YouTuber, that's great. If you're a super fan, awesome. Let's get you in. We've had a father and son combination come look at our Skylanders material. Just make an appointment. You can look through, you can request things. I will set up, my lab is on the left. It has 30 or so of the most popular consoles, all hooked up through a series of switches that we can record video. We can do whatever we want. We have optical disc emulators in there. We've got floppy disk readers. Whatever you need to access these things, we can do that. And we want you to do that. We have over 100 researchers every year. And we have research fellowships. They can be competitive, especially in the summertime, where we could pay you up to $750 for a week of research. Come and do it. Usually you'll write a blog post about what you see, what you've been looking at. But we want these things to be accessible. And like I said, we have researchers from all over the world. Another way, we actually work with developers too. If you played the Atari 50th anniversary celebration or the making of Karateka, a lot of those materials came from us. We scanned those. I made the disk images for the Karateka prototypes that you can play in those collections. So that's one where, because they had the copyright, we're able to work with the developers and be like, yeah, you want the source code? Great, let's make that available. And we're working on changing the law, so even if you can't make it out to Rochester, unfortunately right now the law says you cannot access video games, you can access software. What's the difference between software and video games? I don't know. But there is this copyright exemption that only exists for software that is not video games. We're trying to change that. But we don't know what that will look like. and you'll hear next year. And we're almost to the end. How can you help? Save your work. Even the boring stuff. The most interesting stuff is the company culture, the memos, the thing that says, hey, you guys all stink, wear deodorant. Like that sort of thing exists in our archives. It's funny, but it's showing what's so important about game development. Come visit the museum. We're only 3.5 hours away. We can go visit Niagara Falls. It's about an hour away. There's other things to do in Rochester. Have a garbage plate. It's great. Visit our collections, use our collections, do research. Donate your work. If you're working on an independent game, I would love to have it. There'll become a point where I say that doesn't count anymore, but right now we want more even independent work. It doesn't have to be AAA stuff. And just tell other people about us. All of you are in Albany. Some of you have been there. We talked about it earlier. Some of you have never been there. But please, just tell people about us. There's a lot of people doing game preservation work, and we're one of those. We have an annual Women in Games event. This is the last real slide of information, November 16th. We've had luminaries in the past. Actually, our first year, we had Amy Hennig standing right there in front of a video that I made that included her. Don Daglow is a legendary developer. He does work for the museum. November 16th is our next event. Women from the ESRB, YouTube Gaming, and more will be there to give a talk, and then you'll be able to talk to them and explore the museum. So that's a lot of talking very, very quickly. But this is my contact information. I do think I have, probably 2 minutes, 3 minutes for a question or two, because we're a little early. So this is my contact information. I'm easy to find. I post cool stuff. So I saw a question over here.
Is there a virtual tour of the Strong?
Yes, so there is. So we have a Google Arts and Culture page. So if you search Google Arts and Culture, the Strong Museum, the tour is kind of halfway down the page or more. It's a little outdated. It predates the expansion. But you'll see E-Game Revolution in the state that it was in then, because we have an arcade, we have all the pinball stuff. So you'll actually be able to go around as a Google Street View and view it. Plus there's online exhibits on that page that we're doing more and more of. Really cool stuff. And you can access what stuff we have in the collection, both on that Google page and on the museum webpage. That's listed right there. Yeah?
So for all those all the archive games that people can play, do you have to create emulations for every single one of them?
It depends. So a lot of people that are coming to do research want to play it on the original hardware, so I try to make that possible. But what I'll do is, if it's a floppy disk game, I'll back it up. So a big fun story, if you go to Internet Archive and play Oregon Trail, one of the most popular pirated copies, you start moving, a tombstone pops up that says, "Here lies Andy, pepperoni and cheese." That's not how the game was when it came out. So you can actually, what we do is we don't want that to be the representation of that game, so we'll back that up and put it on the original hardware, but with a floppy disk emulator, so it's preserving that. Or a flash card to run ROMs on the original hardware, just to try to give us that much more life out of these things. And hopefully it's accessible, not just now, but we're really thinking 100 years from now, what is it that all of you are gonna wanna look at? We don't know, so we're guessing. So I'm gonna take the last question as I get off the stage, but feel free, I'm gonna stick around outside. I know there's a lot of stuff, so thank you everybody for coming. Yeah, sticky.